The black limousine stopped outside Torino's funeral home. Cardinal Benedetti stepped out first, his red robes stark against the November rain. Behind him, Pope John Paul slowly walked toward the entrance where 47 known Mafia soldiers waited inside. Vincent the Hammer Torino lay in the mahogany casket. Every Don from the 5 families had come to pay respects. None expected the Vatican. The Pope carried a sealed white envelope. When he entered the chapel, conversations died. Every gun hand moved closer to jacket lapels. Tony Accardo, head of the Chicago outfit, watched the Pope approach the casket. The white envelope trembled slightly in his weathered hands. What was written inside that made grown killers cross themselves and walk away? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Vatican City, 3 days earlier, 6:22 a.m. Pope John Paul II knelt in his private chapel, the weight of 58 years pressing into his knees against cold marble. Before entering the priesthood, he had been Cardinal Karol Wojtyla, but before that, something few remembered. He had been an accountant in Krakow, moving money for families who needed to hide assets from communist authorities. Numbers never lied. People did. The intercom buzzed. Your Holiness, Cardinal Benedetti requests immediate audience. Cardinal Francesco Benedetti entered carrying a leather portfolio, his face gray as winter stone. We have a problem. The Pope rose slowly. Benedetti had managed Vatican finances for 12 years. In that time, the Church's wealth had grown from $2.3 billion to over $15 billion. Officially. Vincent Torino is dying, Benedetti said. He wants to confess. Chicago, Torino family estate, same morning, 7:45 a.m. Vincent the Hammer Torino sat in his study, oxygen tank hissing beside his chair. Cancer had carved him hollow, but his mind remained sharp as the day he'd broken Tony Marinelli's legs for skimming casino profits. His legitimate businesses were impressive. Torino Construction had built half of Chicago's skyline. Torino Shipping moved cargo through the Great Lakes. Torino Financial Services managed pension funds for 3 labor unions. What the IRS didn't know was simpler. For 30 years, every legitimate business had served one purpose: moving money that couldn't be moved legally. His daughter Maria arranged white lilies on his desk. At 45, she still called him Papa and still believed the family money came from construction contracts and shipping fees. She graduated from Northwestern with an MBA, married a pediatric surgeon, raised 3 children who attended private Catholic schools, all of it built on blood money. Papa, the funeral director, called. Everything's prepared. Torino nodded. He'd planned his own funeral down to the hymns, Ave Maria, Amazing Grace, and How Great Thou Art. What he hadn't planned was dying with secrets that could destroy the Vatican. The leather ledger sat in his lap, 200 pages of handwritten entries, account numbers, transfer dates, commission percentages, every transaction between the Catholic Church and the Torino organization since 1963. Maria, I need you to understand something. She sat across from him, her medical degree diploma hanging behind her. She'd wanted to be a doctor like her husband, until Vincent convinced her the family businesses needed management. Another life shaped by money that shouldn't exist. Before you were born, the Church came to us. They needed help moving money. The Italian government was investigating them, trying to claim church property for taxes. Cardinal Marconi approached me through Father Di Marco at St. Anthony's. Torino opened the ledger to the first entry, September 12, 1963. $500,000 transferred from Vatican account 4471B to Swiss bank account 998 ZZ. Commission $150,000. They needed clean channels. We provided them. Over 30 years, we moved $847 million through Swiss, Cayman, and Luxembourg accounts. Our fee was 30%. Maria stared at the numbers, her face cycling through confusion, comprehension, and horror. Papa, this is how your mother got her cancer treatments in Switzerland when insurance wouldn't cover experimental therapy. How we donated $2 million to build St. Catherine's School, where your children learned to read. How we survived FBI investigations when the Gotti family, the Colombos, the Bonanos all went to prison. She stood and walked to the window overlooking Lake Michigan. Her children's sailboat lessons happened on this lake. Their summer house in Harbor Springs was purchased with Vatican money. Every charity donation, every hospital wing, every scholarship funded was all built on this? Vincent watched his daughter process 30 years of family history. The irony is, we probably did more good with their money than the church would have. St. Catherine's feeds 200 homeless people every day. The Torino Cancer Research Center has saved thousands of lives. We built housing for elderly veterans. But it was still theft. Yes, the admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a burnt church. Papa, why are you telling me this now? Because Cardinal Benedetti came here today, not to give me last rites. He came to ensure my silence. Vincent closed the ledger with trembling hands. But I'm tired of carrying secrets that weigh more than this cancer. Vatican City, Cardinal Benedetti's office, 8:30 a.m. How much does he know? Pope John Paul asked. Benedetti spread financial documents across his mahogany desk. Swiss bank statements, transfer receipts, commission records. The evidence of 3 decades lived in neat manila folders. Everything. Torino kept meticulous records. He has account numbers, dates, amounts, authorization codes. If this becomes public... The Pope studied a transfer from 1985. $12 million moved from Vatican account to Credit Suisse, then dispersed through Torino companies, to end up funding Solidarity movement in Poland. His homeland's freedom, purchased with money that technically belonged to Catholic donors worldwide. How did we justify this internally? Emergency discretionary funds. The Curia approved moving assets to protect them from Italian tax authorities. What they didn't know was the commission structure. Cardinal Benedetti had convinced the Vatican's governing council that paying Torino's organization 10% was reasonable for financial protection services. In reality, Torino charged 30%. Benedetti had pocketed the difference for 20 years, $200 million, enough to build cathedrals, enough to feed nations, sitting in Benedetti's personal accounts in Geneva. Does Torino know about your additional arrangements? Benedetti's silence answered everything. Chicago, FBI Field Office, 2:15 p.m. Agent Sarah Chen had been tracking organized crime financials for 8 years. The Torino family remained frustratingly clean. Every business passed audits. Every tax return showed reasonable profits. Every bank account appeared legitimate. But nobody stayed clean in Chicago for 40 years without help. Her cubicle walls were covered with financial flowcharts connecting the Torino organization to legitimate businesses across 3 states. Torino Construction had built the new children's wing at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Torino Shipping had exclusive contracts moving grain exports through the St. Lawrence Seaway. Torino Financial Services managed pension funds worth $340 million. All legal, all profitable, all impossibly clean for a family that had controlled Chicago's South Side since the 1950s. Her partner, Agent Martinez, handed her surveillance photos from that morning. Vincent Torino received a visitor, Cardinal Francesco Benedetti from Vatican City. Chen studied the images through a magnifying lens. Benedetti entering the Torino estate in a black sedan with diplomatic plates. Security cameras showed he carried a briefcase going in, nothing coming out. The meeting lasted 3 hours and 47 minutes. Cardinal visits dying mob boss. That's not a social call. Torino's been in contact with Vatican officials for decades. We've documented at least 30 meetings since 1990, every year right around tax season. Chen pulled the thick Torino financial files from her locked cabinet. 3 decades of investigation yielding nothing prosecutable. His legitimate businesses generated approximately $50 million annually, but the family owned a $12 million estate, sent 3 children to Harvard, donated $2 million yearly to charities, and maintained homes in Switzerland and the Bahamas. The math suggested income closer to $200 million. What if the Vatican isn't just blessing his charity work? Martinez leaned over her desk, studying bank transfer patterns she'd highlighted in yellow. Explain. Look at these dates. Every major Vatican donation to American charities gets routed through Torino Financial Services first. Small transfers, never more than $500,000 each, spread across dozens of accounts. She pointed to a pattern spanning 15 years. The Vatican sends money to Torino companies. Torino companies distribute it to Catholic hospitals, schools, orphanages. Clean, legal, charitable, but Torino charges handling fees. What if those fees aren't just for legitimate financial services? What if the Vatican's been using him to launder money for 30 years? Martinez studied the transfer timeline, and now Torino's dying. Someone's getting nervous about what he might confess. Chen opened another file, transcripts from wiretaps on known mob associates. For 6 months, conversations kept mentioning the Vatican problem and Benedetti's cleanup. I'm thinking the Catholic Church has been moving dirty money through Torino's companies for 30 years, and now Vincent's on his deathbed. Cardinal Benedetti's worried about what gets said in confession. Torino Estate Study, 6:47 p.m. Vincent Torino closed the leather ledger and locked it in his desk drawer. The meeting with Cardinal Benedetti had confirmed his worst fears. The cardinal hadn't come seeking spiritual counsel. He'd come to ensure Vincent's silence. "The Church appreciates your decades of loyal service," Benedetti had said. "Perhaps this confession can wait until you meet our Lord in person." But Vincent had lived too long with blood money. The schools and hospitals built with Vatican funds couldn't wash clean the pension money he'd stolen. The union workers whose retirement he'd spent, the families destroyed when their savings disappeared into Swiss accounts. He picked up his encrypted phone and dialed a number he'd memorized 20 years earlier but never used. "Agent Chen? This is Vincent Torino. I believe we need to discuss some business arrangements." The call lasted 12 minutes. When he hung up, Vincent felt something approaching peace. The truth would destroy everything he'd built. It would send Cardinal Benedetti to prison. It would expose the Vatican's financial corruption to worldwide scrutiny. But it would also free him from carrying secrets that weighed more than his cancer. 3 days later, Vincent Torino died in his sleep. The coroner listed cause of death as respiratory failure due to lung cancer. 2 hours after his death, Cardinal Benedetti called Pope John Paul with an urgent message. "Vincent's family is demanding Vatican representation at the funeral. If we refuse, they'll release his records to federal authorities." The Pope set down the phone and walked to his private chapel. Outside his window, Rome continued its ancient dance, unaware that the Catholic Church faced its greatest financial scandal in 500 years. He had built his papacy on transparency and moral courage. Now those principles demanded he walk into a room full of killers and face whatever truth Vincent Torino had left behind. The sealed white envelope sat on his desk, containing a letter Vincent's widow had delivered personally. Inside that envelope lay evidence that would either destroy the Church or free it from 30 years of corrupted compromise. Pope John Paul picked up his phone and called Cardinal Benedetti. "Prepare a car. We're attending Vincent Torino's funeral. Vatican City, Papal Apartments, Day 2, 4:33 a.m. The encrypted phone beside Pope John Paul's bed rang twice before falling silent. Protocol demanded 3 rings for emergency calls. 2 rings meant someone wanted to remain anonymous. He answered anyway. "Your Holiness, this is Mrs. Vincent Torino." The Pope sat up in darkness, immediately alert. Maria Torino's voice carried the controlled strain of someone who hadn't slept since her father's death. "I have something that belongs to the Church." Torino Estate, private study. Same time Maria stood in her father's office, holding a small digital recorder. The device contained 47 minutes of Vincent's final confession, recorded 3 hours before he died. She pressed play for the second time that night. "My name is Vincent Anthony Torino. Today is November 9th. I am dying, and these are the things I need God to hear before I meet him." Her father's voice, weakened by cancer but still carrying the authority that had commanded respect for 50 years. "For 32 years, I moved money for the Catholic Church. Cardinal Francesco Benedetti coordinated these transfers. Cardinal Luis Fernandez approved the Swiss accounts. Cardinal Michael O'Brien authorized the Cayman Island deposits. 12 names followed, Vatican officials who had personally signed transfer authorizations, approved commission structures, and met with Torino representatives in Rome, Geneva, and Chicago. The church paid us $254 million in commissions. They believed our fee was 10% of transferred amounts. The actual fee was 30%. Cardinal Benedetti kept the difference. $200 million over 20 years, sitting in his personal accounts. Maria stopped the recording. Her father had discovered Cardinal Benedetti's theft only weeks before dying. The cardinal who'd given last rites to her mother, who'd blessed Maria's wedding, who'd baptized her children, a thief who'd stolen $200 million from the Catholic Church. She resumed playback. I kept detailed records of every transaction, account numbers, authorization codes, wire transfer receipts, commission payments. Everything is documented in my personal ledger, secured in the office safe. The recording continued for 38 more minutes. Vincent named specific transactions, recalled conversations with Vatican officials, detailed how money moved from Rome through Chicago to Swiss banks and back to American charities. But the most damaging revelation came at the end. Cardinal Benedetti threatened my family if I exposed his theft. He said the church would claim I was lying, that organized crime families couldn't be trusted. He was right. No one would believe a dying gangster over a cardinal. Vincent's breathing grew labored as cancer claimed his strength. That's why I'm making this recording. Let God judge whether the truth matters more than protecting the Vatican's reputation. Maria dialed the Vatican's emergency line. Vatican City. Cardinal Benedetti's quarters, 5:22 a.m. Benedetti answered his secure phone on the first ring. Sleep had been impossible since Vincent's death. Cardinal, this is Maria Torino. Ice formed in his stomach. Mrs. Torino, please accept my condolences on your father's passing. He made a recording before he died. The silence stretched between Rome and Chicago for 15 seconds. What kind of recording? A confession, naming you and 11 other Vatican officials, detailing your theft of $200 million over 20 years. Benedetti walked to his window overlooking St. Peter's Square. Dawn light revealed early tourists gathering for morning mass. None of them knew their church faced destruction in a dying gangster's final testimony. Mrs. Torino, your father was very ill. Sometimes cancer affects. He recorded specific account numbers, Cardinal, transfer dates, authorization codes you personally signed. Benedetti's hands trembled. What do you want? I want His Holiness to attend my father's funeral, personally, and I want him to retrieve the ledger from our family safe. That's impossible. The Pope cannot. Then I released the recording to the FBI and every major news organization by noon today. The line went dead. Chicago, Accardo residence, 6:45 a.m. Tony Accardo had run the Chicago outfit for 43 years. He'd survived investigations that destroyed 5 other crime families. He'd maintained power by knowing everything that happened in his territory. Vincent Torino's death required careful attention. Accardo's longtime associate, Jimmy the Fish Torrente, entered his home office carrying morning surveillance reports. Tony, we got problems. Talk. FBI's been watching the Torino place for 6 months. Yesterday, some cardinal from Vatican City spent 4 hours with Vincent. This morning, his daughter made encrypted calls to Rome. Accardo studied photographs from the surveillance team he maintained parallel to federal law enforcement. Vincent's meeting with Cardinal Benedetti, the cardinal's agitated departure, Maria Torino's 4 a.m. phone call. What's the Vatican's connection to Torino's business? Money laundering. Has to be. Vincent's legitimate income couldn't support his lifestyle. But his books show massive charitable donations every year, all going to Catholic organizations. Accardo had suspected Vincent of hiding federal partnerships for years. Money laundering for the church would explain why Torino Enterprises never faced serious federal investigation despite obvious wealth beyond legitimate earnings. Get me everything on this Cardinal Benedetti. Financial records, travel patterns, known associates. If the Vatican's been moving money through Chicago, I need to know who authorized it. Vatican City, Papal Study. 8:15 a.m. Cardinal Benedetti entered Pope John Paul's office carrying files that could destroy both their lives. Vincent Torino's daughter has recordings. The Pope looked up from morning prayers. What kind of recordings? Confessions. Naming Vatican officials involved in financial transfers, including specific details about commission structures and account numbers. Pope John Paul had spent 58 years learning to read faces. Benedetti's expression revealed guilt beyond simple fear of scandal. What aren't you telling me, Francesco? Vincent discovered discrepancies in our payment records. The commission structure was different than what the Curia approved. How different? Benedetti placed bank statements on the Pope's desk. Swiss account summaries showing $254 million in total commissions paid to Torino organizations over 30 years. Vatican records showed authorized payments of $84 million. Where's the missing $170 million? Personal management fees for coordinating complex international transfers. The Pope studied his longtime friend and financial advisor. You stole $170 million from the church? I managed financial operations that saved the Vatican from Italian government seizure. The additional compensation reflected the risk and complexity. You stole church money and used Vincent Torino to hide it. Cardinal Benedetti's silence confirmed everything. Pope John Paul walked to his window overlooking Rome. Thousands of faithful gathered below for morning blessing, trusting that their church represented moral authority in a corrupted world. What does Mrs. Torino want? Papal attendance at Vincent's funeral. Personal retrieval of his ledger containing our transaction records. If we refuse, she releases Vincent's recording to federal authorities and international media. The Pope calculated consequences. Expose Benedetti's theft, and the entire Vatican financial structure faced investigation. Protect Benedetti, and the Church became complicit in covering up corruption. Either choice would be judged by history. Prepare a car, Francesco. We're attending Vincent Torino's funeral. Your Holiness, this is extremely dangerous. The funeral will be attended by known organized crime figures. Federal agents will be watching. Good. Let them watch the Catholic Church face its sins publicly. Pope John Paul walked toward his private chapel. And Francesco? Bring the sealed envelope containing your resignation. After we retrieve Vincent's evidence, you'll be leaving Vatican service. The decision that would define his papacy was made. Truth mattered more than institutional protection, even if the truth destroyed them all. Vatican City, Papal Study, Day 2, 10:30 a.m. Pope John Paul spread Swiss bank statements across his desk like evidence at a crime scene. 30 years of financial documents created a paper trail that could destroy the Catholic Church's credibility worldwide. Credit Suisse account 4,471 Zizi, 998, $12.4 million deposited September 1963. Withdrawn in $500,000 increments over 6 months, each transfer routed through Torino Financial Services before reaching American Catholic Charities. Union Bank of Switzerland account 7,743 Emaniter 445, $23.7 million. Purposeless anti-communist activity movement operations in Poland, but the routing through Chicago crime families remained unexplained in Vatican records. Your Holiness, Cardinal Benedetti entered without knocking. We need to discuss alternatives to attending this funeral. The Pope didn't look up from the documents. What alternatives? Papal illness, diplomatic emergency, security concerns. There are precedents for avoiding the truth? Cardinal Benedetti pulled a chair close to the Pope's desk, his voice dropping to conspiratorial whispers. Francesco, you've served the Church faithfully for 34 years. But this situation requires institutional thinking beyond personal morality. The Pope finally met his eyes. Explain institutional thinking. Vincent Torino was a criminal who provided necessary financial services during desperate times. The Italian government was seizing church property. Communist movements threatened Vatican assets across Europe. We needed secure channels for protecting church wealth. Benedetti opened a thick folder containing yellowed documents from the 1960s. Letters from Cardinal Secretary of State requesting emergency financial protection. Papal authorization for extraordinary measures to safeguard church resources. Italian government seizure orders targeting Vatican property. Look at these authorizations, Francesco. Pope Paul VI personally approved using irregular financial channels. Cardinal Vilo coordinated the initial Torino contacts. This arrangement saved the church from bankruptcy. The Pope studied a memo dated August 15, 1963. His Holiness approves Cardinal Vilo's recommendation to engage Chicago-based financial consultants for emergency asset protection. Commission structure not to exceed reasonable professional fees. Reasonable professional fees. What did that mean in 1963? 10%. Standard banking commission for high-risk international transfers. But Torino charged 30%. Market rates evolved. High-risk financial services commanded premium pricing by the 1970s. Pope John Paul walked to his private safe and retrieved a locked metal box containing his most sensitive correspondence. Inside, letters from Cardinal Vilo spanning 15 years detailed the Vatican's growing dependence on irregular financial channels. October 1965. The Torino organization has successfully moved $47 million beyond Italian government detection. Recommend expanding the relationship. March 1968. Emergency funding for anti-communist operations in Eastern Europe requires immediate liquidity. Torino channels remain our most secure option. December 1973. Total church assets protected through Chicago channels now exceed $200 million. The relationship has become essential to Vatican financial security. The Pope read each letter with growing understanding of how gradually the Church had surrendered, moral clarity for financial survival. Francesco, how long have you known about your additional commission arrangements? Cardinal Benedetti's face revealed the calculation of someone weighing confession against denial. The extra fees began as emergency compensation for increasingly complex operations. Moving church money during the 1980s required sophisticated money laundering techniques. Don't call it compensation. Call it theft. The Vatican's wealth grew from $400 million to $15 billion during my tenure. My management generated those returns. The additional fees reflected $200 million in stolen church money. The intercom buzzed. Your Holiness, Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI Chicago office is requesting immediate audience. Vatican City, Apostolic Palace Reception Hall, 1:15 a.m. Agent Sarah Chen had flown overnight from Chicago carrying evidence that could reshape the investigation into organized crime financing. Meeting with the Pope required diplomatic protocols, but Vincent Torino's death had created urgency beyond normal procedures. Your Holiness, I'm investigating financial relationships between the Torino organization and Vatican accounts. We believe Mr. Torino was preparing to provide federal testimony before his death. Pope John Paul gestured for her to sit in chairs normally reserved for visiting heads of state. Cardinal Benedetti remained standing, his discomfort obvious. What kind of testimony? Money laundering operations spanning 30 years. We've documented $847 million in transfers between Vatican accounts and Torino-controlled businesses. The pattern suggests systematic movement of unaccounted church funds. Agent Chen opened her briefcase and produced bank transfer summaries, surveillance photographs, and wiretap transcripts that painted a comprehensive picture of Vatican Mafia financial cooperation. Mr. Torino contacted our office before his death. He indicated willingness to provide documentation and testimony in exchange for immunity regarding tax evasion charges. What documentation? Personal ledgers recording every transaction, authorization codes, commission structures, and Vatican official involvement. He claimed Cardinal Benedetti had been stealing church money using the laundering operation as cover. Cardinal Benedetti stepped forward. Agent Chen, Mr. Torino was a dying criminal seeking to implicate respected church officials in his illegal activities. Any allegations he made should be considered desperate attempts to reduce his legal exposure. Cardinal, we've verified many of Mr. Torino's claims through independent financial analysis. The commission discrepancies alone suggest systematic theft of church funds. Agent Chen placed surveillance photographs on the small table between them. Cardinal Benedetti entering the Torino estate. Swiss bank officials meeting with known Mafia associates. Vatican financial advisors traveling to Cayman Islands accounts linked to organized crime. Your Holiness, We're prepared to offer the Vatican immunity from prosecution in exchange for cooperation with our investigation into financial crimes. The Pope studied the photographs of his closest advisor meeting with criminals, church money flowing through accounts controlled by murderers, Vatican officials coordinating with organized crime families. What cooperation do you require? Access to Vatican financial records, testimony from church officials involved in the arrangement, and assistance retrieving Mr. Torino's documentation from his estate. The funeral, Cardinal Benedetti said quietly. Agent Chen nodded. Mrs. Torino has indicated that evidence is secured in the family estate. She's demanding Vatican representation at tomorrow's funeral as condition for releasing that evidence to federal authorities rather than international media. Vatican City, Papal Private Chapel, 3:47 p.m. Pope John Paul knelt alone before the altar, where he'd prayed every day for 6 years. The weight of institutional corruption pressed against his faith like cancer against bone. His election in 1978 had been seen as divine intervention, the first Polish pope in history, chosen to guide the Church through Cold War challenges and into a new millennium. His moral authority had helped topple communist governments across Eastern Europe. In Poland, his mere presence had given millions courage to resist Soviet oppression. Now that authority faced destruction in a Chicago funeral home, he remembered his mother's death when he was 8 years old. Emilia Wojtyla had whispered her final words, "Trust God's plan, even when you cannot see his purpose." For 50 years, those words had guided every major decision of his life. But what was God's plan for a church corrupted by money stolen from faithful Catholics worldwide? The chapel door opened quietly. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, his most trusted theological advisor, entered and knelt beside him. The German cardinal's presence had become essential during the most challenging decisions of his papacy. "Francesco, I've reviewed the financial documents." Ratzinger's meticulous analysis provided comfort beyond words. If any Vatican official could provide wisdom in this crisis, it was the future Pope Benedict XVI. "What's your assessment, Joseph?" The Church was bankrupted by Italian government seizures in the 1960s. Pope Paul VI faced impossible choices: surrender church assets to communist-influenced Italian authorities, or seek irregular financial protection. The Torino arrangement provided necessary liquidity for essential operations during our darkest financial period. Ratzinger paused, weighing his next words carefully. But Cardinal Benedetti's personal enrichment transformed financial necessity into criminal conspiracy. What began as institutional survival became individual greed. Can the Vatican survive this exposure? Transparency might save us. The faithful can forgive institutional mistakes made under duress. They cannot forgive cover-ups that perpetuate corruption. Our credibility depends on confronting this truth publicly. Pope John Paul looked toward the crucifix above the altar, remembering another moment of moral crisis. In 1981, when Mehmet Ali Agha's bullets had nearly killed him, he'd chosen forgiveness over revenge. That decision had defined his papacy and demonstrated the Church's commitment to mercy over justice. This choice felt more complex. Mercy for Cardinal Benedetti meant complicity in theft. Justice for the Church meant exposing 30 years of compromised decisions to worldwide scrutiny. The funeral tomorrow places us in unprecedented danger. Federal surveillance, organized crime families, international media attention. If I attend personally, you face the consequences of 30 years of compromised decisions made by predecessors who believed institutional survival justified moral compromise. And if I refuse, Mrs. Torino releases evidence that makes the Vatican appear guilty of systematic money laundering rather than victims of one corrupt cardinal. The difference between institutional mistake and institutional criminality. The choice had crystallized into stark alternatives: face dangerous truth publicly or become complicit in covering up crimes against the Church. Pope John Paul closed his eyes and heard his mother's voice across 5 decades. Trust God's plan, even when you cannot see his purpose. Perhaps God's purpose required the Bishop of Rome to walk into a room full of killers and face whatever truth Vincent Torino had left behind. Vatican City, Cardinal Benedetti's office, 6:22 p.m. Cardinal Benedetti sat alone reviewing Swiss bank account statements that documented his theft with mathematical precision. 20 years of skimming commission payments, redirecting church funds to personal accounts, using Vatican authority to enrich himself while believing he deserved compensation for complex financial management. The phone rang. Maria Torino's voice carried calm determination. "Cardinal, my father's funeral is tomorrow at 2 p.m. His Holiness will attend personally and retrieve the ledger containing evidence of your theft. Mrs. Torino, I understand your grief, but these accusations against Vatican officials. I have recordings of our conversation yesterday, your threats against my family, your demands for my father's silence about your stealing $200 million. Benedetti's blood went cold. You recorded our private discussion? My father taught me to document everything involving church business. 23 years of meetings with Vatican officials, all recorded. The line went dead, leaving Cardinal Benedetti alone with the magnitude of his exposure. Tomorrow would bring destruction of everything he'd built over 3 decades of service. But it would also bring opportunity. In the chaos of a mob funeral attended by federal agents and international media, many things could happen. Many people could disappear. He picked up his secure phone and dialed a number in Chicago. Torino Estate, private study, funeral day, 7:30. Maria Torino stood before her father's wall of photographs, each image documenting 40 years of legitimate business success and hidden corruption. Vincent with Chicago mayors, Illinois governors, federal judges, and Catholic bishops, the respectable face of organized crime. But one photograph stopped her breath. Vatican City, 1985. Vincent Torino shaking hands with Cardinal Karol Wojtyla in the Pope's private study. Between them sat an open briefcase containing Swiss bank account documentation. She'd never seen this photograph. It had been hidden behind her father's framed construction awards, discovered only while preparing his office for the funeral gathering. The inscription on the back, in Vincent's handwriting, Cardinal Wojtyla blesses the Polish Freedom Fund, $50 million donation, sacred cause requires difficult means. Maria sank into her father's chair, the photograph trembling in her hands. Pope John Paul, then Cardinal Wojtyla, hadn't just known about the money laundering arrangement. He'd personally approved it. Flashback. Vatican City, April 1985. Cardinal Wojtyla's office. Cardinal Karol Wojtyla studied the financial proposal with the careful attention of someone who'd spent his youth watching Nazis steal everything his family owned, then communists steal what remained. Vincent Torino sat across from him, legitimate in his expensive suit and careful manners, but carrying the scent of violence that no amount of respectability could entirely mask. Outside the cardinal's window, pilgrims gathered in St. Peter's Square, unaware that their spiritual leader was negotiating with a Chicago crime boss to fund revolution in Eastern Europe. Your Eminence, the Solidarity movement requires funding beyond what official church channels can provide. Cardinal Wojtyla nodded. Polish workers faced Soviet tanks with nothing but courage and Catholic faith. Lech Walesa's dock workers had sparked something that could topple communist governments across the entire Eastern Bloc. But revolutions required money for safe houses, underground printing presses, secure communications, and bribes for police officials willing to look the other way. Every dollar sent through official Vatican accounts would be intercepted by communist intelligence services. The KGB had informants throughout European banking systems. The Polish people are dying for freedom, Cardinal Wojtyla said quietly. How much can you move securely? $50 million, routed through Swiss accounts, then dispersed through labor unions, underground newspapers, safe houses, multiple transfer points, shell corporations, numbered accounts. The Polish government will never trace the source back to Vatican City. Vincent opened his briefcase, revealing bank transfer authorizations requiring only cardinal signatures, Swiss account numbers, Cayman Island corporate shells, Luxembourg banking protocols, the infrastructure of international money laundering deployed for sacred purposes. The fee for these services is 30%. High risk requires high compensation. Cardinal Wojtyla understood risk better than most Vatican officials. He'd smuggled Bibles into communist territories hidden in flour sacks. He'd ordained priests in secret ceremonies in farmhouse basements while Soviet informants searched for underground Catholic networks. He'd maintained communications with persecuted believers across Eastern Europe, using codes that would have meant imprisonment if discovered. $15 million seemed reasonable payment for freeing his homeland from Soviet oppression. The money would buy Polish workers time to organize, space to operate, and hope that the Catholic Church stood behind their struggle for human dignity. What guarantees do we have regarding security? My organization has moved money for governments and corporations for 20 years without detection. We've handled funds for labor unions, political campaigns, and international businesses. We understand discretion better than banks understand profit. What Cardinal Wojtyla didn't understand was that 30% commission represented 3 times the rate Vincent quoted to Vatican financial administrators. Cardinal Benedetti had negotiated a 10% fee with the Vatican Treasury, then privately arranged for Vincent to charge 30% and split the difference. The extra 20% would line Torino family pockets for decades while funding the most important political revolution of the 20th century. But Polish freedom required difficult compromises. Cardinal Wojtyla signed the authorization documents, blessed the arrangement with a prayer for God's forgiveness for using unholy means to achieve holy purposes, and watched $50 million disappear into Swiss accounts that would fund strikes, protests, and underground operations that ultimately toppled communist governments across Eastern Europe. 2 years later, Cardinal Wojtyla became Pope John Paul II. 4 years after that, the Berlin Wall fell and Poland became free. The Solidarity movement's success validated every moral compromise. Free Poland justified collaboration with Chicago criminals, until Vincent Torino decided to confess everything. Present day, Vatican City, Papal Study, 8:45 a.m., Pope John Paul held the photograph Maria had faxed to his private office, his younger self blessing an arrangement with organized crime that had seemed justified by sacred necessity. Francesco, Cardinal Benedetti entered, his face ashen with exhaustion. "We need to discuss security protocols for today's funeral." The Pope set down the photograph. "There are no security protocols for walking into our past mistakes. Your Holiness, I've contacted associates in Chicago. They can ensure Mrs. Torino's evidence never reaches federal authorities. You want to murder a widow to cover your theft? I want to protect the Church from scandal that would destroy Vatican credibility worldwide." Pope John Paul walked to his window overlooking St. Peter's Square, where thousands of faithful gathered for morning mass, trusting that their spiritual leader represented moral authority untainted by criminal compromise. "Francesco, show me Cardinal Villo's original correspondence regarding the Torino arrangement." Cardinal Benedetti retrieved files from the papal safe. Letters spanning 15 years detailed the Vatican's growing dependence on irregular financial channels, but the most damaging document was Cardinal Wojtyla's signed authorization for Polish funding. His Eminence Cardinal Wojtyla approves emergency transfer of $50 million through Chicago intermediaries for anti-communist operations. Commission structure acceptable given security requirements and political necessity. Signed in his own hand, dated 3 months before Solidarity workers began strikes that would ultimately free Poland from Soviet control. How many people know I personally authorized this arrangement? Vincent Torino kept detailed records. Every Vatican official, every transaction, every authorization code. If his ledger becomes public, the Pope who freed Poland will be remembered as someone who collaborated with criminals to achieve it. Chicago, FBI Field Office, 10:22 a.m. Agent Sarah Chen reviewed surveillance footage from the Torino estate. 3 limousines had arrived that morning carrying representatives from Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia crime families. Vincent Torino's funeral would host the largest gathering of organized crime leadership in decades. And the Pope's walking into this? Agent Martinez studied facial recognition scans identifying known criminals entering the funeral home. 47 made members from 5 different families, plus Vatican officials, international media, and enough federal surveillance to monitor a small war. Chen opened Vincent Torino's file, focusing on financial analysis that had taken 6 months to complete. "Martinez, look at this pattern." She pointed to bank transfers spanning 25 years. Every major political event in Eastern Europe corresponds with large money movements through Torino accounts. Polish Solidarity Strikes, 1985. Hungarian Revolution, 1989. Czech Velvet Revolution, 1989. Romanian Uprising, 1989. So, Vincent Torino wasn't just laundering Vatican money, he was funding the overthrow of communist governments across Eastern Europe. Agent Chen pulled additional files documenting CIA funding for anti-communist operations, amounts that closely matched Vatican transfers through Torino organizations. What if the Vatican and CIA were using Torino's money laundering operation to jointly fund operations they couldn't officially support? You're suggesting the Pope collaborated with organized crime and intelligence services to topple communist governments. I'm suggesting Vincent Torino's confession could expose 30 years of covert operations that violated international law. The implications expanded beyond Catholic Church corruption. If Vincent's ledger documented joint Vatican-CIA funding channeled through organized crime, his death might prevent exposure of operations that remained classified at the highest levels of government. Chen, we need that ledger before someone else decides Vincent's secrets are worth killing for Torino. Estate, funeral preparation, 12:30 p.m. Maria Torino supervised final arrangements while federal agents maintained surveillance from unmarked vehicles across the street. The afternoon would bring together forces that had never openly acknowledged their mutual dependence. She walked through rooms filled with flowers sent by legitimate businesses and organizations that had benefited from Torino family generosity. St. Catherine's School, Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Chicago Youth Foundation, Solidarity Veterans Association. Institutions built with money stolen from church donations and pension funds, but institutions that had saved thousands of lives and provided education for children whose families couldn't afford private schools. The moral mathematics hurt her head. Her phone rang. Tony Accardo's voice carried the authority of someone who'd controlled Chicago's underworld longer than most politicians had held office. Mrs. Torino, my condolences on your father's passing. Thank you, Mr. Accardo. I understand Vatican officials will be attending today's service. Yes. Your father was a careful man who kept sensitive records. Those records might be valuable to people besides federal authorities. Maria understood the subtle threat. My father's business arrangements were his own concern, of course. But sometimes family members inherit problems they didn't create. The line went dead, leaving Maria alone with the knowledge that her father's confession had created enemies more dangerous than FBI agents or corrupt cardinals. In 6 hours, the most powerful criminal organization in America would gather to honor Vincent Torino. The Pope would arrive carrying secrets that could destroy the Catholic Church. FBI surveillance would record everything. And somewhere in that chaos, people would decide whether truth or cover-up served their interests better. Maria opened the family safe and removed Vincent's leather ledger. 200 pages documenting every financial crime that had funded some of the 20th century's most important political changes. Polish freedom, Hungarian independence, Czech democracy, Romanian liberation. All purchased with stolen church money moved through Chicago crime family accounts. She also removed Vincent's personal insurance policy, audio recordings of every meeting with Vatican officials over 23 years, cardinals requesting specific funding amounts, papal representatives authorizing commission structures, Vatican financial advisors coordinating with known criminals. Everything needed to prove the Catholic Church's systematic collaboration with organized crime, and everything needed to destroy the Pope's moral authority if it became public. In 3 hours, Pope John Paul would walk through her front door and face the consequences of decisions made with good intentions but impossible moral costs. Maria prayed her father had been right about the power of truth to set people free, even when that truth destroyed everything they'd built their lives believing. Torino Funeral Home, Main Chapel, 2:14 p.m. Pope John Paul approached the casket carrying the sealed white envelope. Maria Torino met them at the front row, her face carrying the controlled grief of someone who'd spent 3 days preparing for this moment. Your Holiness, Mrs. Torino, she gestured toward the casket where her father lay surrounded by white lilies. He wanted you to read his final letter during the service. Pope John Paul opened the sealed envelope with careful hands, aware that 47 criminals and 12 FBI surveillance teams watched his every movement. Inside, handwritten pages in Vincent's precise script. But as he began reading, the words didn't match what he'd expected. Your Holiness, for 30 years, I believed we were helping the Church protect assets and fund sacred causes. I was wrong. Cardinal Francesco Benedetti has been stealing church money and using our laundering operation as cover for his personal theft. The Pope's hands stilled. This wasn't the confession of a criminal seeking absolution. This was testimony from someone who'd discovered he'd been used. The Vatican authorized commission payments of 10% for our financial services. Cardinal Benedetti told us the Church approved 30% rates for high-risk operations. We charged 30% and sent 20% directly to his personal accounts in Geneva. Over 20 years, Cardinal Benedetti stole $200 million from the Catholic Church. Pope John Paul looked toward Cardinal Benedetti, who stood behind him unaware that his theft had been exposed in Vincent's final testimony. 3 months ago, Cardinal Benedetti contacted me demanding silence about our financial arrangements. When I questioned the commission discrepancy, he admitted skimming church funds for administrative oversight. When I threatened to confess this to Vatican authorities, he threatened my family. The letter continued for 4 more pages, detailing how Benedetti had manipulated Vatican financial records to hide his theft. Bank account numbers where stolen church money sat unused. Transfer authorizations forged with papal signatures. Commission structures that existed only in Benedetti's communications with criminal organizations. The money your church sent to fund Polish freedom, Hungarian revolution, and Czech independence was never stolen from Catholic donations. Cardinal Benedetti stole money meant for worldwide Catholic charities and blamed the theft on commission payments to organized crime. The final revelation hit like ice water. Cardinal Benedetti has been feeding information to Tony Accardo about Vatican financial investigations. Mr. Accardo's organization received advanced warning about federal surveillance because Cardinal Benedetti needed their continued silence about his theft. Pope John Paul closed the letter and looked across the chapel toward Tony Accardo, whose face revealed the calculation of someone whose informant had just been exposed. Same time, chapel rear agent Sarah Chen listened through her earpiece as surveillance teams relayed the Pope's facial expressions while reading Vincent's letter. Whatever that letter contained, it had fundamentally changed the Vatican delegation's understanding of this situation. She activated her throat microphone. All units, prepare for rapid movement. The Pope's reaction suggests new information we weren't prepared for. Through telephoto lenses, federal photographers documented every expression, every gesture, every moment of what appeared to be genuine shock from Vatican officials who'd expected different revelations. Chapel front, moments later, Maria Torino leaned close to the Pope's ear, her voice barely audible above the chapel's organ music. Your Holiness, Cardinal Benedetti visited our home yesterday. He offered my family $5 million to destroy my father's records and claim he died without making confessions. She handed him a small digital recorder. This contains Cardinal Benedetti's threats against my children if we released evidence of his theft. Pope John Paul understood the magnitude of Vincent's final gift. The confession that could have destroyed the Vatican's reputation instead exposed one corrupt official who'd used institutional authority to enrich himself while blaming his crimes on church policy. Chapel side aisle. Same moment, Cardinal Benedetti sensed the change in atmosphere without understanding its source. The Pope's body language had shifted from resignation to something approaching relief. Maria Torino's whispered conversation suggested complications beyond their planned script. He approached slowly, aware that every movement was being recorded by federal surveillance teams. Your Holiness, perhaps we should proceed with the private blessing, and departed. Pope John Paul turned to face his longtime advisor, the man he'd trusted with Vatican financial operations for 12 years, the cardinal who'd stolen $200 million while convincing the Church its money was being used for sacred purposes. Francesco, Vincent's confession makes interesting reading. I'm sure his final illness affected his memory of financial arrangements. He remembered specific Swiss account numbers, bank transfer dates, authorization codes you personally created. Cardinal Benedetti's face went ashen as he realized his theft had been documented by the one person who could verify every transaction. Your Holiness, Vincent Torino was a criminal who kept better financial records than the Vatican treasury. The Pope handed him Vincent's letter, read his description of your administrative oversight fees. Across the chapel, Tony Accardo watched the Vatican delegation's quiet confrontation with growing understanding. Cardinal Benedetti's nervous gestures, the Pope's changed demeanor, and Maria Torino's confident bearing suggested the carefully planned narrative had collapsed. For 20 years, Cardinal Benedetti had provided advance warning about federal investigations, Vatican financial audits, and potential exposure of their money laundering operations. In exchange, the Torino organization had maintained silence about commission structures that existed only in Benedetti's private arrangements. If Benedetti's Vatican position became compromised, Tony's organization lost their most valuable source of protection against federal prosecution. He gestured slightly to his security team. Cardinal Benedetti had become a liability that required immediate management. Chapel front. Final moment. Pope John Paul folded Vincent's letter and placed it back in the white envelope. The truth had rewritten 30 years of assumed corruption, transforming institutional conspiracy into individual betrayal. Cardinal Benedetti hadn't just stolen church money. He'd convinced the Vatican they were accomplices in necessary financial crimes while enriching himself with funds meant for Catholic charities worldwide. The relief felt profound and terrifying. The Church's reputation could be saved by exposing one corrupt official. But that exposure would require acknowledging how completely they'd been deceived by someone they'd trusted with their most sensitive operations. Mrs. Torino, your father's confession serves truth above institutional protection. Yes, Your Holiness. Then we proceed with that truth, whatever the consequences. Cardinal Benedetti stepped backward, realizing his 30-year theft was about to be exposed to federal agents, international media, and organized crime figures who'd protected his secret in exchange for Vatican intelligence. The plot that had seemed like Vatican corruption was actually the story of one man's greed, disguised as institutional necessity, and that man was running out of options. Torino Funeral Home, Chapel, 2:47 p.m. Cardinal Benedetti read Vincent's letter with hands that trembled beyond concealment. 20 years of carefully constructed lies dissolved with each handwritten line documenting his theft with mathematical precision. Swiss account 4,471 Zizi Beta, $47 million stolen from Catholic Relief Services donations. Luxembourg corporate shell 998 Delta 7, $38 million diverted from Vatican Education Fund. Cayman account 7,743 Omega, $115 million taken from worldwide Catholic hospital funding. Vincent hadn't just documented Benedetti's collaboration with organized crime, he'd documented massive theft from funds meant to feed starving families, educate impoverished children, and provide medical care for the desperate. Your Holiness, Benedetti whispered, these accusations are fabricated by a dying criminal seeking to implicate innocent church officials. Pope John Paul took the letter back, his voice carrying authority that had confronted communist governments and toppled dictatorships. Francesco, Vincent provides account numbers you personally opened, transfer codes you created, authorization signatures that match your handwriting. Chapel rear, FBI surveillance position agent Sarah Chen watched the Vatican delegation's confrontation through binoculars, coordinating with surveillance teams positioned throughout the funeral home. Martinez, the Pope's body language suggests genuine shock at whatever that letter contains. Maybe Vincent's confession exposed more than we expected. Chen activated her secure radio. All units, maintain position but prepare for rapid deployment. This situation is evolving beyond our intelligence assessment. Through her earpiece, Agent Rodriguez's voice carried urgency from the mobile surveillance unit. Chen, you need to hear this. We intercepted Cardinal Benedetti's encrypted phone calls from yesterday. Patch it through. The recording quality was excellent despite electronic encryption. Cardinal Benedetti's voice, stressed but clearly audible. Mr. Riccardo, Vincent Torino's family possesses documents that could compromise our arrangement. What kind of documents? Financial records detailing commission structures and authorization protocols. Cardinal, our arrangement has always been legitimate financial consulting services. The legitimacy depends on Vincent's family maintaining discretion about specific operational details. A pause, followed by Tony Accardo's measured response. Cardinal, Vincent's illness has created complications. Perhaps his suffering should end naturally before he says things that hurt his family. I'm not asking you to. You're not asking. You're requesting prayers for a peaceful death. Sometimes prayers are answered through human intervention. Agent Chen stopped breathing. Cardinal Benedetti had solicited Vincent Torino's murder to protect his theft of church funds. Martinez, that's conspiracy to commit murder. Federal murder charges for a Vatican cardinal. Plus it means Vincent didn't die of cancer. Someone accelerated his death. Chen activated her throat microphone. All units, we now have active murder conspiracy evidence. Cardinal Benedetti solicited Vincent Torino's death. Prepare for immediate arrests. Chapel front. Same moment Maria Torino leaned close to Pope John Paul. Her voice barely audible. Your Holiness, there's something else. She handed him a small digital device. This contains the last conversation I recorded between my father and Cardinal Benedetti. The Pope pressed play, keeping the volume low enough that only those immediately nearby could hear Vincent's weakened voice. Cardinal, I'm dying. These secrets need to be confessed before I meet God. Vincent, your medical condition may be affecting your judgment about financial arrangements. My judgment is clear enough to document 30 years of transactions. You stole $200 million from the Catholic Church. Vincent, your family's safety depends on maintaining confidentiality about sensitive church operations. Are you threatening my daughter? I'm reminding you that criminal organizations sometimes face consequences when they threaten legitimate institutions. Cardinal, you're the criminal. And if something happens to my family, every major news organization will receive copies of our complete financial records. The recording continued for 18 more minutes. Cardinal Benedetti's increasing desperation, Vincent's determination to confess everything, and finally, Benedetti's thinly veiled suggestion that Vincent's cancer treatment could be adjusted to ensure peaceful death before dangerous confessions. Pope John Paul stopped the playback and stared at Cardinal Benedetti with the expression of someone witnessing absolute moral corruption. Chapel Center Isle Tony Accardo had survived 43 years controlling Chicago organized crime by reading situations before they exploded. Cardinal Benedetti's exposed position, the Pope's obvious shock, and increasing federal surveillance indicated their carefully maintained arrangement was disintegrating rapidly. He gestured subtly to his security team, Jimmy Torrente, Mickey Carlotto, and Bobby the driver Benedetto. 3 reliable men who understood that loose ends required immediate management. Accardo had protected Cardinal Benedetti for 20 years because the Cardinal provided advance warning about federal investigations. But exposed cardinals were worse than useless. They were liabilities that could destroy entire criminal organizations. If Benedetti faced federal charges for murder conspiracy and financial theft, his cooperation deal would implicate every crime family that had benefited from Vatican intelligence. The Cardinal needed to disappear before federal agents realized the scope of his criminal involvement. Chapel front. Final preparations. Pope John Paul folded Vincent's letter and Maria's recordings, understanding that the evidence in his hands could save the Catholic Church's reputation while destroying one of its highest officials. Mrs. Torino, this evidence proves Cardinal Benedetti manipulated the Church into believing we were accomplices in necessary financial crimes. Yes, Your Holiness. Your father's confession serves justice above institutional protection. Maria nodded. He wanted the truth known, regardless of consequences. Cardinal Benedetti stepped closer, his voice carrying desperate authority. Your Holiness, Vincent Torino was a dying criminal whose pain medication affected his mental capacity. These recordings and documents represent desperate fabrications. Francesco, Vincent's account numbers match your Swiss bank deposits to the dollar. Pope John Paul stood, his decision crystallized by moral clarity that had sustained him through 50 years of priesthood. The man he'd trusted with Vatican finances had stolen hundreds of millions from Catholic charities while convincing the Church they were complicit in necessary crimes. The truth would destroy Benedetti, but free the institution from false guilt about collaborating with organized crime. Francesco, you're under arrest for theft of church funds. The words carried across the chapel like thunder, reaching 47 organized crime figures, 12 federal agents, and international media representatives who'd attended expecting different revelations. Cardinal Benedetti realized his 30-year theft was about to become public record. His criminal partners were calculating whether he represented a liability, and federal agents were preparing to charge him with soliciting murder. He had minutes, perhaps seconds, before everything collapsed. His hand moved toward the concealed pistol he'd carried for protection against exactly this situation. Torino Funeral Home, Main Chapel, 3:03 p.m. Cardinal Benedetti's hand closed around the concealed beretta beneath his scarlet vestments. 20 years of careful planning, $200 million in stolen church funds, and a network of criminal partnerships were disintegrating in real time. Your Holiness, you don't understand the complexity of these financial arrangements. Pope John Paul stood beside Vincent's casket holding evidence that would free the Catholic Church from 30 years of assumed moral compromise. Francesco, I understand theft disguised as institutional necessity. The Church survived because of my financial management. The Church survived despite your criminal betrayal. Cardinal Benedetti pulled the pistol halfway from concealment, his voice carrying the desperation of someone whose life's work was being exposed as systematic fraud. These documents will never reach federal authorities. The chapel fell silent. 47 organized crime figures, 12 federal agents, international media representatives, and Vatican officials watched a cardinal of the Catholic Church threaten the Pope with a concealed weapon. Same moment, chapel perimeter agent Sarah Chen spoke into her throat microphone. All units. Cardinal Benedetti is armed. Repeat. Vatican official is threatening the Pope with a concealed weapon through telephoto surveillance. Federal photographers documented every moment as Cardinal Benedetti's hand emerged from his vestments holding a black pistol aimed toward Pope John Paul. Martinez, signal tactical teams. We have active threat against a foreign head of state. Chapel Center Tony Accardo gestured sharply to his security team. Jimmy Torrente, Mickey Carlotto, and Bobby Benedetto moved subtly toward positions flanking Cardinal Benedetti, their own weapons remaining concealed but accessible. For 43 years, Tony had controlled Chicago organized crime by understanding when situations required immediate decisive action. Cardinal Benedetti threatening the Pope crossed lines that even criminals respected. Jimmy, Tony whispered. The cardinals become unpredictable. Chapel front. The confrontation. Pope John Paul looked directly at Cardinal Benedetti's pistol without flinching. 58 years of life had taught him that moral courage required facing death as calmly as facing truth. Francesco, you've served the Church faithfully for 34 years, but theft and murder threats cannot be resolved through violence. I prevented the Vatican's financial collapse. You enriched yourself while convincing us we were criminals. Maria Torino stood beside her father's casket, clutching the digital recordings that proved Cardinal Benedetti's guilt. Cardinal, my father trusted you with confession. You responded by arranging his murder. Cardinal Benedetti turned the pistol toward Maria. Mrs. Torino, your family's safety depends on these documents disappearing. Pope John Paul stepped between the weapon and Maria, his voice carrying the authority that had confronted communist governments and defended human dignity across 5 continents. Francesco, lower the weapon. I won't allow 30 years of faithful service to be destroyed by false accusations from criminals. The accusations are documented in your own Swiss bank accounts. The Pope opened Vincent's letter and began reading aloud, his voice carrying to every corner of the chapel. Cardinal Francesco Benedetti opened Swiss account 4471 Beta on September 12, 1978. Between 1978 and 1998, he deposited $47 million stolen from Catholic Relief Services donations meant for African famine relief. Cardinal Benedetti's face contorted with rage and desperation. "Stop." Pope John Paul continued reading. Luxembourg account 998 Delta 7 received $38 million stolen from the Vatican Education Fund between 1985 and 1995. This money was designated for Catholic schools in South America. I said stop. Cayman Islands account 7,743 Omega holds $115 million taken from worldwide Catholic hospital funding. Cardinal Benedetti convinced Vatican officials these funds were paying necessary commissions to organized crime, when actually he was stealing money meant for cancer treatment centers, children's hospitals, and medical missions. The moment of truth, Cardinal Benedetti raised the pistol toward Pope John Paul's chest, his voice breaking with 30 years of accumulated guilt and desperation. "You don't understand the sacrifices required to protect this institution. I understand the difference between protection and theft." From across the chapel, Tony Accardo's voice carried quiet authority. "Cardinal, lower the weapon." Cardinal Benedetti turned toward Tony, confusion replacing rage. "Mr. Accardo, our arrangement was legitimate financial services, not theft from Catholic charities, not murder threats against widows." Jimmy Torrente stepped from behind a floral arrangement, his own weapon trained on Cardinal Benedetti. "Tony's right, Cardinal. You cross lines even we don't cross." Cardinal Benedetti realized his criminal partners had become his enemies. His Vatican colleagues had discovered his betrayal, and federal agents were preparing to arrest him for conspiracy to commit murder. He had nothing left to lose. Federal intervention agent Sarah Chen and tactical teams burst through the chapel's main entrance as Cardinal Benedetti's desperation reached critical mass. FBI dropped the weapon. The chapel erupted into controlled chaos. Federal agents with tactical rifles, organized crime figures reaching for concealed weapons, Vatican officials diving for cover behind wooden pews. But Pope John Paul remained standing beside Vincent's casket, directly in Cardinal Benedetti's line of fire, his voice carrying supernatural calm. "Francesco, 30 years of faithful service doesn't need to end with violence." Cardinal Benedetti's hand trembled as federal laser sights painted red dots across his chest. "Your Holiness, I served this church with everything I had. You served yourself with everything the church had." The truth of those words broke Cardinal Benedetti's final resistance. 20 years of Swiss bank deposits, forged authorization documents, and stolen charity funds couldn't be justified by claims of institutional protection. He lowered the pistol. Resolution of the confrontation, Tony Accardo gestured to his security team. "Stand down. Let federal agents handle this." Agent Chen moved carefully toward Cardinal Benedetti, her weapon trained but not threatening. "Cardinal, place the weapon on the floor and step away." Cardinal Benedetti complied, his scarlet vestments stark against the funeral home's gray carpeting as he knelt and placed the beretta at his feet. "Cardinal Francesco Benedetti, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, theft of church funds, and money laundering." Pope John Paul walked to where Cardinal Benedetti knelt, his voice carrying forgiveness even in the moment of justice. "Francesco, the church will pray for your soul while earthly courts judge your actions." As federal agents led Cardinal Benedetti away in handcuffs, the truth settled over everyone present. The Vatican had been victim, not accomplice, in 30 years of financial crimes disguised as institutional necessity. The church was free from false guilt about collaborating with organized crime, but the cost of that freedom was the destruction of one of its most trusted officials. Federal Courthouse, Chicago. 3 months later, 2:15 p.m., Cardinal Francesco Benedetti stood in orange prison clothing as Judge Patricia Williams pronounced sentence for conspiracy to commit murder and theft of $200 million from Catholic Church funds. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The courtroom remained silent as federal marshals led away the man who'd served 34 years as a cardinal of the Catholic Church before revealing himself as history's most successful religious thief. Vatican City, Apostolic Palace, same day, 8:47 p.m. Pope John Paul signed documentation establishing independent oversight of all Vatican financial operations. Swiss banking relationships terminated, Cayman accounts closed. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger entered carrying implementation reports. Francesco, every Vatican transaction now requires independent verification. No single official can authorize transfers exceeding $50,000. And the restitution fund? Complete. Mrs. Torino has received full compensation. The $200 million has been redistributed to Catholic charities worldwide. Graceland Cemetery, Chicago, late afternoon. Pope John Paul walked alone among the headstones carrying white roses toward Vincent Torino's grave. No security detail, no diplomatic protocol, no international media attention. Just an old man honoring someone who'd chosen truth over comfortable lies. Vincent's headstone was simple granite with an inscription Maria had chosen, Vincent Anthony Torino, devoted father. In the end, he chose truth. The Pope placed white roses beside the stone and knelt on grass still brown from November's cold. Vincent, your confession saved the Church from carrying guilt that was never ours to bear. Around him, Graceland Cemetery stretched toward Lake Michigan, peaceful as a prayer, quiet as forgiveness. The chaos of that November afternoon, federal agents, organized crime figures, international media, had faded into memory. Truth had survived. Justice had been served. The Catholic Church had been freed from 30 years of false shame about financial necessity that was actually one man's greed. Vatican City, St. Peter's Basilica. Dawn, Pope John Paul celebrated Mass for newly ordained cardinals, each man taking a modified oath that included unprecedented transparency requirements. I promise to serve the Catholic Church with integrity, to manage church resources with absolute accountability, and to choose truth over institutional protection when moral courage is required. 12 new cardinals repeated the words in Latin, English, and their native languages. None would control financial operations without independent oversight. None would access church funds without documented approval from multiple authorities. The Church had learned the difference between institutional survival and individual corruption. Papal study. Final reflection. Pope John Paul sat in his private chapel as Roman morning light filtered through stained glass windows. 6 months had passed since Vincent Torino's funeral changed everything. Tony Accardo testified against Cardinal Benedetti and received reduced sentencing. The FBI closed its Vatican investigation, confirming the Church had been victim rather than accomplice. Maria Torino established the Vincent Torino Foundation for financial transparency. But the deepest healing had been internal. For 30 years, the Vatican had carried shame about collaborating with criminals. That shame had been based on lies. Polish freedom had been funded legitimately. Eastern European liberation had used donated money appropriately. The Solidarity movement had succeeded through moral means, not criminal compromise. Truth had set them free, even when that truth required walking into a room full of killers to find it.